Chapter 4.7, Part 3. We are still on warriors and battle scenes. And that's kind of obvious on this one, but this is our last image there. I cut off on that last one. So this is from Benin in Africa. And this is from the 16th, 17th century. Brass is about 18 inches high, probably about 15, 16 inches wide. High relief. Now, if you kind of go through, we talk about sculpture. Low relief is this kind of thing, or even this carving into the this sort of leaf shape here. But this part is low relief. He is in high relief because he's coming out of the picture plane. This flat area here. He's coming out. His limb is more than halfway out. Does that make sense? So it's almost 3/4 out, and then the wrist and hand, and then his sword or his spear here, and his other weapon over here, those are fully away from the plane. So that's high relief. Okay, he's still stuck to this background, so he's still a relief sculpture. So I'm just going to kind of set that out for you, and you'll get into this in chapter 2.4 later, but this is a good example. There are holes here, if you see these here. So there were nails through these different plaques, and these were put onto columns in a building. So there'd be multiple brass plaques to commemorate different battles over time. And you'd walk into this interior of this space, and you'd just see all these intense warring heroes, and you would know that there was like a serious there's serious warfare, and that we would probably be in one of these guys or his descendants palace, so we want to be intimidated and scared. That's the point of it. Now, these were possibly shinier and brighter and sort of glinting when we come in, and giving us this sort of really intense stare from all sides. There would be several columns. There were many number of these at one time. Unfortunately, the destruction of these plaques is mostly due to the British. When they took over Benin, they colonialized many countries and many parts of the world for quite a long time. They destroyed this palace, but a few of them remained and were put into museums. But this is our main guy here in the middle, our main warrior, and then these guys are less important, and the reason we know that, if you recall, hierarchical scale, he is larger than his two attendants. So he's also coming out at us more fully. So that's how we know he's the most important. So they're both military and spiritual leaders of a West African state that was at its height between 1450 and 1700. They're called Obas, the warrior king. And usually you'll see a jaguar. I don't see it on this one. Jaguar, sort of a sheath or skirt kind of a thing, and that would indicate the emperor. So this guy must be a little bit lower down, but we get in importance. But we get the sense of his importance versus the smaller characters in this space. All over the palace, yeah. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here to the artist's response to war. So it's not always supportive, It's not always commemorative. It's not always heroic. So some of this is a cathartic exercise, and it releases emotion and also inspiring awareness of realities of war. So we did kind of, if you think about the first two images we looked at, the first two photographs from the Civil War and the Vietnam War, in a lot of ways those were to inspire awareness of the war. But before the camera was invented in 1908, Goya painted the 3rd of May. Now this was painted, if you notice, in 1814, or it was published at that time. He may have been working on it from sketches. He sketched all kinds of things going on, all kinds of dark happenings. These are Napoleon soldiers over here, and they are rounding up citizens that rebelled, and they are shooting them wholesale. So it's just executions going on. And this is meant to give us this dramatic scene. If you remember Tenebrism, that's not exactly what this is, but that sense of a contrast of very bright white, Christ-like hands, dark sky, all these rifles pointing at him, blood. It's giving us this very intense scene that is drawing our attention. So this is at the Prado Museum in Madrid, Spain. Very large canvas, 8 feet high by 11 feet wide, and was again published after the fact. It was a bit dangerous to put this out there in protest of Napoleon at that time. But this was sort of the beginning of protest of war, or depicting some of the negatives of what soldiers do. And we also see that with Delacroix a little bit later. But there are these instances where, there's not a support for what the soldiers are doing, but this is the beginning of that time. Color, light, and line, those are all emphasizing our figure. Then we're going to get on to Picasso in 1937, and this is a really important piece. This is even larger, 11 feet high by 25 feet wide. Massive piece. One of the things you may notice immediately is the lack of color. It's just in black, white, and gray. So that was one intentional decision by Picasso. He always worked in color up to this time, and he was not a political artist before the bombing of Guernica. He's a Spaniard. A lot of people get confused that Pablo Picasso lived most of his life in France. The reason for that is that Franco, who was a general and then became the dictator of Spain for a very long time, and I'd have to check, but they both lived into the 1970s, but Picasso refused to return to Spain until Franco was dead, and he wouldn't return this painting. I think it was returned after his death, because it was in New York for quite some time. And there's also a famous tapestry that's made just like this. So the black and the white was to emphasize the chaos and the seriousness, but it's also to mimic the way that he found out about this bombing. It was in a newspaper in France. He was in Paris, and he saw images in the newspaper, and it looked like a night bombing. It was it was so dark and gray. There's some newspaper references here, like that sort of scribbling right there. That's to indicate the idea that he found this out in the newspaper, and he felt like he really needed to do something to show his reaction to this horrible bombing. Now, some background on the bombing itself. This is 1937, and the bombing takes place in 36. And what happens is Franco is approached by Hitler. No, I beg your pardon. It is April 37. Okay, sorry. I thought it was in 36. April 1937 is when the bombing happens. Franco's approached by Hitler and the Luftwaffe, and they want to test out the ability to bomb a town with their planes. Now, remember I said World War I is the beginning of aerial bombing. Well, it gets a little more sophisticated running up to World War II. Now, World War II has not happened yet. This is the Spanish war that happens before. There's a lot of turmoil in Europe at that time. So the Spanish War working up toward World War II. Okay, so Franco says, yes, you can go ahead and bomb this little nonsense town, and we don't care about it. In the Basque country, which is neither France nor Spain, so Franco had a special, I wouldn't say hatred, but a sort of a ambivalence toward these people. So he said, go ahead and bomb these people. No warning, nothing. So over 1,000 people, civilians, just regular people, were bombed over 3 hours. I think it's something like 5,000 bombs were dropped. We're not sure of the real numbers of actual dead, but it was just chaotic and horrible. And you see a mother holding her baby here. I mean, just unexpected, undeserved, just random choice of, in Franco's mind, disposable people that could just be bombed. So that horror and that injustice hit Picasso pretty hard. He wasn't living in Spain at the time, and he wasn't a political person at the time. He needed a painting to show at the World's Fair in 1937, and as he started something else that's sort of underneath this, we believe, and some other sketches. And once he heard about this, this is what he came up with. Just the chaos and the distortion and this sort of screaming horse. And there's a lot of symbolism here. I'm not going to get too into it, but the idea of innocence being murdered, and he wanted to really have an outcry and a reaction to that. Cubism is what we're looking at here. He was already working in this way for quite a long time. He'd already been working in Cubism for close to 20 years, so his work already kind of looked like this, where you'd see two eyes on the side of a head, and some distortions, and these have to do with Einstein's theories. I think I mentioned that a little bit about how the theory of relativity of time and seeing multiple events in one moment. So that's part of the chaos that we're seeing here, but it lent itself well. The Cubism worked very well in this way. So it's a protest piece. Franco just allowed this test to happen. It's just really horrible. He didn't discuss the work, and he would not return the painting, and he didn't return himself while Franco ruled. We're going to move on to Anselm Kiefer, a German who was born in 45, I believe, so right when the World War II ended. And as he was growing up, he felt like there was so little accountability of the Germans, of what happened during the war. So this piece is called Breaking of the Vessels, and it has to do a little bit with Kristallnacht, the breaking glass. Down here, there's broken glass of the night that the Jewish people were pulled from their homes and put into concentration camps. So it's to do with the Jewish religion, and specifically the Kabbalah, and a collection of Jewish mystical writings. That's on page 646. So the words Ein Sof, which means the infinite presence of God, are written on the arched piece of glass above the bookshelf. That's up here. You can't really see it from here very, very lightly. Ein Sof. Some of this is hard to understand because it's in German, but partly that people weren't talking about this or dealing with it, and there was all this knowledge in these lead. He made these books out of lead. They're really interesting. But you can't walk to it. It's dangerous to get to the knowledge, if that makes sense. So that's partly what that has to do with the war. Loss of life and destruction. His work is really intense. He uses a lot of different materials, and it's very large. And he's even building well, I won't get into that. You'll have to Google him. Very interesting artist. Okay. A different artist, very different look to this. It looks a lot like, this is a street art piece. Looks a lot like if you've seen Banksy's work. It's very similar in the way that he's using stencils. This is an Egyptian artist, Ganzir, and this is called Tanks versus Bike. And if you remember that sort of Arab Spring, which happened and sort of went away, but this isn't quite to do with that. This is a sort of a protest piece. This is a kid with some bread on the top of his head, and he's just riding a bicycle, and a tank is overcoming him. And he's commenting on just the sense of injustice and the sense of the revolution in February 2011. He was assisted to do, and he used stencils, and the artist Sad Panda here added his own artwork, and since then there have been some like figures under here that were put on by another artist. But he's actually Mohammad Fahmy, known as Ganzir, and he became internationally famous for his graffiti art criticizing the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. So since the Egyptian Revolution of February 2011, they had um, taken over. So the crushed bodies that we don't see here that came later after this piece, because as I said, other street artists add to this. That was an actual occurrence where some protesters were trying to save a church, and um, they were attacked by security forces. So it's a collaborative piece. Another piece, the domestic tension. This is a really wild piece. So this guy's really brave. He is an artist that he was researching about how drones are being used remotely, where there's a Colorado military person were dropping bombs on Iraq, and he's an Iraqi-born artist, so of course his work's bound to be very political and combining that in a way with the personal. But he wanted to kind of play around with this virtual versus reality. So he set up this paintball gun that would shoot at him, and he was in the space, in this sort of gallery space or real space, and people could do this through the internet. 80 million people looked at this piece, and something like 60,000 shots were taken from 137 countries. So the paintball, there's the little paintballs, we can barely see them here, come down and they'd be shot out at him on this sort of device, probably set up, like almost like a little bench here with some electronics. The computer's probably off over here so we can't see it. So people are watching this happen. That's part of it. And they're deciding if they want to take a shot at him. And you can see how this place is just covered in paint. He's got a little paint on himself. And he's ducking and running. And it's sort of enacting a war-like piece, if that makes sense, in a way, and about physical removal. So he's wanting to create a physical impact in viewers by enabling them to identify with the physical effect on his body. Really out there piece. But again, back to the idea that technology is changing a lot of the artwork that we make. So it's a provocative work. He's trying to raise awareness. His brother was killed by an American bomb. So it's an interactive performance. So he does it for a month. It's not forever, But being in that space, it's just got to have been very intense.